Hello and welcome to Pods Like Us. I'm Martin Quibell, known to my friends as Marv, and today I'm talking with Ant Short, the presenter and producer of Therapy for Me and the Corona Diaries with Steve Hogarth. Hey Ant, how are you?
I'm really well, Marv. I'm really, really well. Looking forward to this actually. Thanks for having me on. I was very, very touched when you said we could get this arranged.
It's okay. How were you first introduced to podcast?
Well, in my previous life, I used to work for a company called Shaw, who are a microphone manufacturer, and I was sales director for Shaw and worked for them for about 15 years. And they were based down on the edge of the M25 at a place called Waltham Abbey. And I live up in West Yorkshire, sort of home Firth neck of the woods. And so it was a 3.5 hour trip there and 3.5 hour trip back, and I used to do that a couple of times a month. Now, when you start to do a journey, a lot of times, what I tended to find was that I'd do the journey home and not be able to remember sort of any of a 3.5 hour, 200-mile trip. And I found that as I was listening to music and what have you in the car, I just literally used to tune out, and I'd arrive home thinking I can't remember anything about that journey, which kind of spooked me a little bit. I thought it was a little bit scary that, I'd be in a car hurtling along and not really, I'd done the whole thing on autopilot effectively. And somebody suggested to me that maybe start listening to a little bit of speech in the car. And a lot of people, you hear a lot of people complain that they don't like things going on in the car because it distracts them. I was actually looking for something to distract me, to actually keep me kind of in the moment. So I started listening to a bit of Radio 5 and a bit of Radio 4, and then a friend suggested, why not listen to podcasts? Why not to try a few podcasts, just as something different to engage with? And my degree's in politics, so I started looking around and realised there were quite a few sort of politics-based shows kicking around, and I started picking up on those. And I think the first one I really fell in love with was something called The Political Party, which was is a guy called Matt Ford,
Yep.
who he's probably actually based not far from you. He's a Nottingham lad, I believe. And he was doing these events where he'd have an audience event, and he'd interview a politician, and then he'd package it up as a podcast and put it out. And I started listening to them, and then that took me from there to listening to things like John Pienaar's politics program. So it wasn't podcast per se, but it was kind of radio stuff that had been on that you'd kind of missed, that you could save up through the course of the week and then catch up on over a journey. And from there, I kind of branched out into other political stuff and things that were actually more, I guess, recorded as podcasts rather than just captured and then repackaged. And then, of course, the Brexit vote happened, the referendum happened, and I'm a staunch Remainer. I got quite involved in the whole process, but I'm very much a staunch Remainer. And from there, I ended up. I probably got to my podcast love, which is a thing called the Remainiacs, which is it's not that ranty, but it's it was a whole comment on the whole Brexit process from a perspective that was fairly similar to mine, and those have still become my go-to podcasts. So unlike what I suppose I get involved in producing, a lot of my podcast listening is very much is very much politics based. And it keeps me up to date, but it also allows me to get a little bit. I'm 49, so it allows me to get a little bit irate as well, which is probably not good for me. But in a strange way, I find it, I find it relaxing.
Crikey, we are both 49.
Yes.
Yes. So, how did you decide to go into podcasting yourself then?
Well, bizarrely, the first podcast I was involved in was one when I was at Shaw. So Shaw do a podcast called Shaw Shots, And it was started by a guy in the UK, and the marketing manager in the UK, a chap called Paul Crognali. And we'd been talking about it, and I'd sort of been very keen and said, "Oh, we really must do this. It's a great idea." And he recorded a few of these things, and they started talking to people that Shure as a brand knew, and sort of record producers and people who worked in event production and those kind of things. And I said one day, do you know what? There's a really great story, because everybody at Shure knew I was a Marillion fan. And it was a bit of a running joke, really, because, you're either a Marillion fan or you poke fun at Marillion fans. It kind of falls into that. And I don't mean that in a harsh way, but that kind of how it tends to be. It's not something that's seen as particularly cool, but... if you are a Marillion fan, then you're normally very vocal about it. It's probably the music equivalent of being vegan, that you go around and you tell everybody about it. So I said to Krogs, to Paul, there's I'm going to bang on about Marillion here, but have I ever told you the story of how Marillion effectively created crowdfunding, how they effectively invented crowdfunding? And I gave him a quick précis of the story. And I said, do you know what? I'm sure if I asked Steve, I'm sure he would tell that story as a podcast, because it's a great story. As a thing that has is very much of its time and was revolutionary. It's a really good story to tell, and he tells it very well. So I got in touch with Steve Hogarth and said, would you mind being on the podcast? Would you go through and talk us through this particular story? And H was fine and said, yeah, no problem. So I kind of bundled a load of gear into the car, and I ended up sitting around his kitchen table, and we recorded this episode of Sure Shots, which is still available. You can still find it, and he's a really, really, really good interview. I mean, he was very good value, and it all worked out quite nicely. And I ended up, for whatever reason, editing it. Because they used to go off to a guy in the US to do them. And because it was something very close to my heart, I was like, oh, do you know what? I'm going to do it, because I can make sure that it's tweaked as well as it can be tweaked and things aren't cut out. And I can kind of present it and say, look, that's it. Don't mess about with it. It's finished. Yep. And so I sat down, and edited it in GarageBand, because I'd always been a Mac user. And had my first go at messing about with a podcast format, and I actually produced a dry run of it. So I put a bit of incidental music on it, and I put it into a format, and it ended up getting changed because Shure had their own kind of music and what have you. But I produced it as a thing, so I could listen to it, and I gave it to a few people to listen to before I forwarded it on, and it went really, really well. It seemed to work fine. H and I seemed to have a reasonably good rapport when we were chatting, and I did this and then kind of forgot about it. Kind of completely forgot about it. Was really proud of it. Pushed it on. Thought, oh, that's something I could see myself doing if the moment arose. And just left it, and it got put out there, and it's available, and you can go and listen to it. And I'm still very proud of it. But what that meant was that a couple of years later, I parted company with Shure, and we'd got to a point where I'd been thinking about a change. I'd done it for a long time, and an opportunity arose. There was having a reorganisation. An opportunity arose to allow me to move on. And I thought, you know what, it's the right sort of time. So I decided to leave Shure, and I'd built in a little bit of time so I could have a break. And I'd worked for, since leaving university, I'd worked sort of 25 years straight. And I thought, do you know what, I'm gonna have a 6-month time out. And while I was having this time out, a very good friend of mine, who's the mum of my eldest son's best mate. So we went out for a coffee. She's got her own business. She's a brand consultant, and she helps people with their personal brand. And we were talking, and she said, "You know what? I really quite like the idea of doing a podcast." And I sort of said, "Well, look, I've had a little, really tiny bit of experience of having done one of these, and I'd love to help you out. And I've got nothing, I'm not planning on doing anything at the moment. So, and I've got the equipment. Why don't we do it together? And we ended up having lots of coffees and lots of conversations. And we ended up producing this podcast, which was called On Brand With, where she interviewed a load of people who'd been her clients. And the whole idea was that it was a kind of, for Deborah, it was an advert for her business. So, the way she attracted clients was very much that she would do a lot of these 45-minute taster sessions, and then somebody would have to make a decision whether they wanted to engage with her and work with her. And for what was a relatively big financial commitment, people didn't really get much of a chance to, the only reference point may be having seen her once. So what we thought was, well, why don't we do a series of case studies? Why don't we give people a more sort of considered view of what you do? So we went out and we did these interviews, and we produced 13 episodes in her first series, and it went really, really well. And then I started saying to people, I've been starting out doing a bit of podcast production. And there were two people that I mentioned this to. One of them was a guy called Jason Hunt, who has an event called the UK Guitar Show, which is in Birmingham every February, March time. And the other one was Steve Hogarth. Yep. And Steve had rung me about something else. He'd rung me about something to do with Shaw, and I'd got to know him through the Shaw relationship, and he'd rung me and asked me a Shaw question, and we got talking, and I said, I've actually moved on from Shaw, and he said, what are you doing? And I said, well, one of the things I've been doing is I've been messing about with some podcasts, at which point he kind of said, do you think I should have a podcast? And I said, well, absolutely I do. Having been on one with you, I absolutely think you should, and that's kind of what started us off with that one. And it was the same thing with Jason with 9 to 42. He same thing. We had a conversation, and he sort of said, I've had people saying to me I should do a podcast. What do you think? And in both instances, both shows kind of came from that initial conversation. Really, it wasn't a case of me pitching for business. It was more a case of me saying, well, I've been doing a bit in that space, and conversations followed, and then before you know it, you're setting up microphones and you're pressing the record button. Wow!
So, how did Therapy for Me come about?
Well, Therapy for Me is the secret very much is in the name. If you finish a job that you've done for a long time, and it wasn't just the job with Shaw. I'd worked in the music instruments industry for about 25 years.
Yeah.
And one of the highlights of the year was that there's this great big music show that goes on in California in January called the NAMM Show. And it's where the great and the good and all the music brands get together, and they, it used to be a showcase for new products, and it still is to a certain extent, but it's become a bit of an international networking get together. And of course, if you've done what I've done, which is, probably every year for the past 15 years, go to, California in January, and have a week out in the sunshine, particularly because it's about the third week of January. So all Christmas has gone away and you're starting to get a little bit miserable because it's still dark and cold and horrible. Yeah. When you're used to having that in the diary to look forward to, it was weird thinking that this year, 2020, I wouldn't be doing that. And it was the week in the diary that I'd not been looking forward to, because I thought, do you know what? All my social media feed's going to be full of people who are out in NAMM, and you take pictures and you share with people where you are. And I used to do it. It was exactly what I used to do. I get there, the first thing I do is take a picture of a palm tree and then just say to everybody, "Oh, look at me, I'm in California." So you knew it was kind of coming, but it was such a great week for me, because having been in that industry for so long, everywhere you turned, you bumped into people you'd known for a lot of years. And of course, because it was an adjusted time zone, and because everybody was only there for that one event, when you met somebody, if they weren't rushing off to something, then you would have, you'd start a conversation, which invariably would end up with a coffee or at a bar somewhere. So it was a fantastic, it was a fantastic week, and I was privileged to be able to do it as many times as I did. So as we were approaching this week, I could tell that I was a low. I was just at a low point. Not because anything was wrong. I was, to a certain extent, I was feeling a little bit sorry for myself. But I'd also had a problem with, because I tried to run. I tried to run every other day. And I'd had an injury, which had stopped me running for a few weeks. And running for me was a great head clear. So I was facing this double whammy of something that I wasn't going to be doing this year for the first time in ages. And the fact I wasn't running either, which wasn't really helping me, clear out. So I found myself sat at home, literally with lots of stuff rattling around my head. And I thought, do you know what? It probably would be therapeutic to say this out loud. So I kind of set a microphone up, and I recorded the first couple of episodes. I recorded a little intro, and then I recorded, what then became the format. And what I do with therapy for me is I just capture a few minutes every day, Monday through Friday, of something that's rattling around my head. And it might be total nonsense, and it might be something that's quite serious.
Yep.
And what happened was the whole thing came together really, really quickly. And what I kind of wanted was I wanted something that only I had done. So in terms of the fact that, I cobbled together the artwork myself. I recorded all the incidental music myself. I wanted the whole thing to just be me, which meant that it's kind of got a very kind of thrown together kind of, lo-fi kind of feel about it. But I was also hoping that it would have some honesty to it as well. It's raw in places. It's quite, it's very raw in places. But it was never really meant as something that necessarily people, would listen to. I.e., if you listen to it and it resonated with you, great. If it didn't, it wouldn't stop me doing it. Because, the routine of doing it and getting involved in doing it, and the way it helps my brain work and allows me to say certain things that I'm struggling with out loud. And that's how I ended up with the title, because it literally is, it is therapy for me, that just happens to be out there as a kind of a thing. And I think what tends to happen, the listening numbers aren't particularly high, but what I've had a lot of people listen to it. So I think people dip in and out with it. Yeah. It isn't something where necessarily people will plot all and go all the way through. There are some people who do that, but you'll get a lot of other people who will say, "Oh, I listened to an odd few episodes and what have you." It's not, it's not meant to be something that keeps you on tenterhooks. But it's I say predominantly it's just for me. But then I get a lot of people quoting it back to me. I get a lot of people saying, "Oh, that thing you said then, I really feel like that," which is kind of weird, really.
I quoted one of those to the other day. I can't remember what it was now.
It was the donut one.
It was.
I got a bit incensed about. Not incensed, but yes, there is something about the honesty of a donut. Yeah.
Life is a ring donut.
Yeah, I did. Yes, I did. I did do that.
You did. Dear me. So how many shows are you actually involved with?
Right. Well, at the moment, 5, but they're not all on the go at the same time. So therapy for me is a constant. That's been, ever since that started, that's not stopped. And that doesn't really take an enormous amount of time. And as I say, it's relatively lo-fi. So that's something that will continue as long as I've got something to say. I will carry on doing that. I've got Corona Diaries, which is the one with H that kicked off early part of this year. We've just wrapped on chapter 26, and that's every week. And then we produce some extra content because we have we use Patreon. We have an option for people to support the show, and if you support the show, we produce extra content. So that's effectively 6 podcasts a month that Steve and I do for that. And then 9 to 42, the guitar show one with Jace, that's a couple of episodes a month. And I'm just about starting the second series of On Brand with Deborah, which is about to kick off. So her first series was 13 episodes, and we think we're going to try for a similar number for her second series. And then I kind of produce one for the MIA as and when it's required, which is the Music Industries Association, which is something that's called Behind the Beat. But I don't really count that as such, because that tends to be a repackage of content in a podcast format rather than that we're actually going out and authoring podcasts. So I would like to do that with the MIA at some point long term, but at the moment that's just more, as I say, it's more of a repackaged format. So I guess I've touched 5 over the course of the last year.
Okay, so how do you put these shows together? How do you record them, and then how do you edit them?
Okay, so 9 to 42 and TCD are both products of lockdown. So we originally wanted to produce those shows in a space with a guest, and I'm a huge fan of being in the room with the guest if you can do it. But in both instances, that wasn't possible. The first couple of episodes of both were recorded that way, and then it very quickly became evident that we couldn't do that. So in both instances, we record over Zoom, but what we do is we record audio locally. So when I do Corona Diaries, I record my audio, onto a PC at this end, and Steve records his at the other end, and then we swap files, and then we piece together the audio that way round. And it's only really a problem for that first case of syncing the audio, which is the biggest. The biggest task, really. And it's the same with 9 to 42, except there's 3 of us. So normally there's Jason and myself hosting, and then we have a guest. And we do it via Zoom, so we've got a visual sync. So it's close to being able to see somebody and be in the room with them and see the facial expressions and those kind of things. And then I assemble. I take the audio and I assemble the audio after the event. Obviously, with Corona Diaries, having a professional musician means that incidental music wasn't a problem. So we use things that Steve has composed for little bits of incidental music, and that one was one that once we'd got the format down and we knew what Corona Diaries format was going to be, because it moves, it's got a consistent format, but it ultimately breaks into 3 component parts. So we have the introduction and whatever today's kind of topic theme is, or whatever today's question is, or whatever the underpinning kind of point is that we're trying to get to. Then there's a reading, because he has a diary. He's got 2 published volumes of diary, so we read a section of his diary, or he reads a section of his diary, and then we come back and we have a bit of feedback and a bit of question based on the diary extract. So that's roughly how Corona Diaries works, and we split it into 3. Okay. With Jason, with 9 to 42, it's a straight interview. And we just, for the first time this last episode, we split an interview in half because it went on too long. We had a show that when it was put down in its original format was 1 hour and 35 minutes. And we both agreed that was too long. In my head, I think for anything between 45 minutes and an hour is kind of podcast nirvana, if you can get there. With Steve's, with Corona Diaries, we tend to overrun. So we tend to do 1 hour and 5 and 1 hour and 10. We're constantly trying to get ourselves disciplined to try and get it down to about an hour, but we don't seem to be able to manage it. Jason and I are much better at getting to 45, 50-minute episodes. So in both instances, recorded on Zoom, or recorded using Zoom as a reference point, and then assembled. And I use a piece of software called Studio One, which is I've used them all. I've used Cubase, I've used Logic. There's nothing wrong with GarageBand. GarageBand's perfectly acceptable for podcast production. I ended up getting Studio One free with an interface that I use and really liked it. Really found it worked for me. And I suppose with anything like that, when you do quite a lot of editing, it's about workflow. And the package that you end up being the one that you can navigate your way around the fastest is the one that you end up sticking with. And I'm quicker on Studio One than I am on anything else. So I've ended up sticking with Studio One.
Okay. How do you choose the guest that you have on 1942?
It's 942 because it's
942.
942 is only because it's a guitar string gauge. So if you buy electric guitar strings, then 9 to 42 is kind of the standard for Strat players. And I'm a Strat player. As it turned out, I play 946s and Jace plays 1042. So we ended up at 942 because neither of us actually played them. But so how do we? A lot of it comes down to, it started off with the people who were involved in this year's event, in the 2020 event, because when I went down to record the first interviews, those people were in the room. So I did 3 or 4 of those interviews, while we were at the show itself, so that they kind of chose themselves. And then since then, when we started on lockdown, we had a weird thing where lots of artists were available to talk. So we didn't really have a plan to talk to, for argument's sake, Glenn Matlock, who was the original bass player in the Sex Pistols, or Earl Slick, who was David Bowie's guitarist. There wasn't a plan to speak to these people. They just, it kind of fell in that somebody mentioned to Jason, do you want to talk to, would you like to talk to Glenn? And we both said yes. Why wouldn't we want to speak to a Sex Pistol? And then the person who who represented Glenn said, you do know he's got Earl Slick staying with him at the moment because they play in a band together, and Earl couldn't decided to stay in the UK rather than fight his way back to the US at the beginning of the lockdown. Would you like to speak to Earl? Well, if somebody sort of says to you, do you want to speak to David Bowie's guitarist? You're not going to say no.
No.
So, and it was a little bit like that. We had, through lockdown, they just and Jason works, he has the guitar show, but he's got to know a lot of agents because he's booked a lot of acts for the guitar show. So we then started going through the back catalogue of people that had been at previous shows. I obviously know Marillion, so I sort of, once saw if Steve Rothery could do one, which he very kindly agreed to do. I employed a guitarist, singer-songwriter guitarist called Mary Spender at Shaw. She worked at Shaw for a year, and Mary's got an incredible following on YouTube and has done work with a lot of brands like Andertons, and has worked with a load of people, and he's kind of part of that wave of self-produced YouTubers. And I rang up her and said, do you fancy doing one? And she very kindly said yes. So it's been a little bit of mix of people we've known, and also people that through the beginning of lockdown were just available. So I mean, we banked about 5 or 6 interviews right at the beginning, whereas now we're doing them more, probably recording, I guess, everything's been recorded. Well, we've nothing in hand for 9 to 42 at the moment, so we've got the next one lined up, and that will be recorded. So those are fresh. Those are within a week of being recorded, they go out. In the same way that with Steve, we don't bank Corona Diaries episodes unless one of us can't be available. So we record on a Monday, and that show goes out to the Patreon, the patrons. It goes out to them on a Friday, and then goes out to the rest of the world on a Monday. So that's never more than 7 days. Never more than 7 days ahead, if that makes any kind of sense.
Yeah. You're giving yourself a good long period to be able to get the episode perfect, ready for going out. You're always 7 days ahead.
Yeah, I mean, we've done a lot. We've worked on a lot tighter timescales when we've had to, but we like to work to that kind of timescale. So, and I think when you're producing for other people, one of the things I've said to everybody I've worked with is, I'll advise and I'll talk to you about what I would do in certain situations, and in pretty much all cases, I've come up with a format. I've come up with an initial edit of what I think the show should sound like, and then we've worked on that as a collaboration. But I never press the schedule button. You know, I give my we record the thing. It gets mixed and edited. I always give everything a final listen through, and then you know, and then it's down to the person I'm working with to say, yeah, that's great, I'm happy, and they push the schedule button. So that's the one thing I've always worked with. I'm not going to presume to do something on anybody else's sort of behalf, but as with all of them, you get to know the people you're working with, so you get to be able to do things in the way you know they would want them to be done, and it makes it very easy then. So I'm sure now, you know, if I said to Steve Hogarth, look, you know, I know you're away, just leave them with me, I'll get it all sorted, I'm sure he would be fine and would just say, yeah, no problem, just you know, trust you just do what you need to do. But I don't like to work like that. I like to go back and say, look, I'm finished, I'm done, I think it's great. When you're happy, you hit the button.
Yep. Okay. So how long have you been a fan of Marillion?
Oh.
Well, there you go. There's the big question.
Right. Okay. So I got into Marillion through the Misplaced Childhood album. I loved Kayleigh when it came out as a single. Still think it's one of the, you know, particularly for that time, I thought it was a perfect 3-minute pop record.
Yeah.
And didn't buy Misplaced Childhood as an album in itself. I ended up buying an album called Thieving Magpie, which as it turned out was the last release with Fish, because it was the live album that came out on the back of the Clutching at Straws tour. So ended up buying Misplaced Childhood, Thieving Magpie from Woolworths in Retford. Never forget, bought it from there. Because a friend of mine was working at the time, so I bought it from Woolworths, from a girl called Louise Windle, who was working there, who I still keep in touch with. And I got into the live version of Misplaced Childhood. So initially listened to it, didn't even realise that Kayleigh was part of an album that was a complete piece of music. So, you know, wasn't there at that point in time. And became a big fan of Thieving Magpie, particularly the complete recording, the 40-odd minute recording of Misplaced, which I still think is better than the studio album. And was kind of aware and involved with Marillion at that point in time, which would make me sort of 16, 17, somewhere around about there. And I remember listening to it a lot around about the time I was doing my A-levels. Then, and it was very much a teen angst moment, without a shadow of a doubt. Very much a teen angst moment. It was one of those albums that just spoke to me. It was quite morose. It was obviously a little bit depressing in places. It was all the things that I felt as a sort of 17-year-old, you know, young man. Ended up doing my A-levels, didn't quite get the results that I needed to get into university. Ended up taking a year out, and all my friends disappeared off to university, and I got a job for a year. And I got a job in Worksop, working for a company called Steatley Minerals. And I used to walk into, in my lunch hour, I'd walk into the centre of Worksop, which isn't very glamorous. And there was a record store there. So once or twice a week, I'd go into this record store, and I bought a copy of the Hooks in You single, which was the first single off Season's End. Yeah. And this was an independent record store. And if you remember back in the day, you used to be able to buy CD singles for 99p. So there'd be a load of, unless it was a really big band, anything they were pushing, you used to buy these CD singles for 99 pence, and they'd have 3 or 4 tracks on them. Yeah. And I remember buying this and being knocked out by this song. And I was playing guitar at the time, and I sit down and it was quite a rocky tune, and I worked out the guitar part and all those kind of things. And as a consequence, I ended up buying the Season's End album. And heard that album, which was the first album that Steve Hogarth did with the band, and just literally fell in love with this record. Thought it was one of the greatest things I'd heard. Thought the guitar playing was amazing. Thought the songs were amazing. Thought everything about the band was great. And kind of really at that point, probably because I'd not really lived through the Fish years, almost not made my allegiances, but I kind of made the decision that this was the thing that sounded new and fresh and the thing that I liked. And it kind of went from there. So I rediscovered all the Fish stuff and went back and listened to all the original albums over a couple of years, and appreciated them. But because I'd never been a Genesis fan or a prog fan particularly, thought they sounded a bit dated. I loved the live version of Misplaced Childhood, but thought the studio album sounded dated. And I'm talking about 1989 sort of time, 1990 when I was at university listening to those. I just thought, yeah, they're great, but they sound like a long time ago. And so I made my decision, and it just all followed from there. I went to see the band for the first time on the Christmas dates, which were after the Season's End tour, but the Christmas saw the band for the first time with Hogarth in Rock City in Nottingham, which remains one of my favourite venues because it's a proper little sweatbox of a venue, and just amazing. I mean, I shouldn't say this, but venues where you find yourself sticking to the floor because that much beer's been spilt, and saw the band there and just was blown away. Absolutely blown away by them live. They still remain one of the greatest live bands, bar none. I've seen a lot of bands in my time. They're absolutely superb. And it just kind of went from there. And they've been the soundtrack. Because, as I say, I'm not a prog fan. I don't sit in that I don't do all the Genesis stuff and all the other stuff. I don't explore lots of things around the edges of Marillion. I listen to. You'll find me listening to the Stones or to Dylan but then the Alarm or it could be Billy Joel or it could be, I'm not that typical Marillion fan. But this, and as I say, I'm not saying I rejected the Fish stuff, but I found it over time. I found it harder and harder, and yet there's just so much in the stuff with Steve Hogarth that I really found resonated, and it's lasted all that time. It's like I can't think of one point in since I started. I've never gone away and rediscovered the band. I've been involved all the way through. I was one of the people who threw their money in when they crowdfunded. Anarachnophobia. I was one of the people that threw my cash in, for that, and I've always done 2 or 3. I mean, in the early days, I'd go 3 or 4 times on a tour, and went to the album launch party of Holidays in Eden, and lots of things. Joined the fan club and all those kind of things, in a way I've never done with another band, and but then because of working for Shaw and because the band used Shaw product, just got to know, just ended up one day, found myself staying nearby, dropped a message to a guy called Roderick Brunson, who used to be the studio manager and also did front of house sound for them, and literally found his address on the website and dropped him a message just to say, look, I work in the industry, I'm staying in Aylesbury overnight, I know the band are somewhere near here. Any chance I can pop in and say hello? And it then just went from that simple email. Got a message back saying, yeah, pop in. We'd love to see you. This is where you need to come. Went in. Some of the band were in that day. Said hello to a few people. I work for Shaw, and then a phone call came back. Can you help us with this? And it just all started from there. And I think we developed a friendship over about a 10-year period, really. That's kind of resulted in where I am now. So it was never anything more than kind of having got to know them, and then just slowly being told, well, look, if you next time we tour, just let us know, and whichever show you want to come to that show. So, and then suddenly you start going to a few shows as a guest, and then the next thing you go to a show as a guest and it's a backstage pass, and then you start to become part of the furniture in the kind of in the arse end of the band, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
They get used to seeing you either at the recording studio, or they get used to seeing you. It's normally Manchester I go to. They get used to seeing you at certain gigs, and then you get to know people, and then before you know it, somebody will pick the phone up. So Steve Rothery might pick the phone up and say, "Oh, can you help me with this?" Or H will pick the phone up and say, "Can you help me with?" And that's how these things then tend to develop, and then you end up finding yourself chatting to somebody backstage for an hour, and before you know it, you're just somebody that is in that part of the equation.
So what would you say is your favourite album by Marillion?
Oh dear, that's right. There isn't one, there's three. And they're all from slightly different periods of the band, really. Season's End still remains a firm favourite, and I can still put that on and feel the way I felt about it. When I was in my first year at university, listen to it. Then, and there's a couple of very special songs on the album. Easter's a very special song. After Me is a very special song for a lot of personal reasons. So that one will always be there. Afraid of Sunlight is an astonishing achievement, and is the album that, if that had been written by anybody other than Marillion, probably would be being hailed to this day as a masterpiece. If Radiohead had produced that, or Coldplay had produced that, that would absolutely be hailed as a masterpiece, because there's something about that record that is just so out there. I don't know how they arrived at that particular album, but it's absolutely astonishing. I mean, there's a song on there called Beyond You, which is the most gut-wrenching thing I've ever heard, and is probably my favourite Marillion song, full stop. And then Fear, the most recent album, which I didn't expect to feel the way I feel about Afraid of Sunlight in terms of technically how good an album it is, ever again. So Season's End's got this place in my heart for a lot of, for a whole load of reasons. Afraid of Sunlight just is there as a thing that's just perfect, really, as far as I'm concerned. And I thought that was it. And there's been other songs and other albums I've thought, oh, that's amazing, but I never felt the way I felt about Afraid of Sunlight about any album since then, until Fear came along. And then Fear just appears, and it's this just thing that's just angry and charged and brutal and brilliant and tender, and just I thought, how does a band who are on album number 18, how do they produce that then at this point in their lives? That shouldn't happen, but it has, and it's just astonishing. So I've got the three. That's kind of, and there's everything else in between I can listen to. I'm not one of these people that rejects things and what have you, but those three in of themselves, they're, and I mean, a lot of fans will say to me, well, what about Brave? And Brave's an amazing thing. But Brave's a dark journey. And Brave can be a hard listen. In the same way that OK Computer is a hard listen. And yeah, I don't feel that same way about Season's End or about Afraid of Sunlight, or even about Fear, which is equally dark, but there are light moments in Fear, and I think the thing with Fear, it was just so, for me, it was so unexpected. I didn't expect to have an album from them again that from beginning to end I felt like that about. Whereas I'd got myself going to albums and going, well, actually, yeah, the album's okay, but that track and that track and that track are great, and the rest is fine, and there's nothing wrong with it, and for most bands it would be brilliant, but it's not like I go to Afraid of Sunlight and go, well, there's nothing on here that isn't just astonishing. So they're the three, and don't ask me to pick one, because I'm just not going to do it.
No, I'm not going to do that. I agree with you about Fear. I think there's a beautiful flow throughout the whole album, and musically it works, going from one song to the next, or it's like a suite that just beautifully flows throughout. And it was definitely on top form with getting all those lyrics together as well on there.
Oh, it's I think the other great thing about Fear is that, as with most albums, the track that hooks you in then becomes the track that isn't the one that remains the track that you really, really gravitate to. So, Living in Fear, which became the single, hooked me first. There's something about that particular track that hooked me in, and the one I struggled with most or took the longest was White Paper, and yet White Paper now, is just that track that I just think is quite phenomenal. And of course, you've got the Anger, in El Dorado. You've got Anger in the New Kings, both which are very relevant lyrically to today. And then you've just got the sheer beauty of the Levers in the Middle, which is an astonishing piece of music. And I think, I can't imagine a world without any of the albums, particularly the Hogarth albums. I can't imagine the world without any of them. But I absolutely can't imagine a world without Fear, or a world without Afraid of Sunlight, or a world without Season's End, because they've just become so important. So important to me. There aren't many albums that stand up to the amount of listening that Marillion albums do. That you can listen to literally hundreds of times and find something new, or not find yourself, bored by, or find that goes stale. And there aren't that many albums like that. Exile on Main Street, as a Stones fan, still sounds fresh and vibrant, and it evokes what it must have been to record that album in that stately home in France. It has all that going on. It's captured the entire moment, and I can listen to that album over and over. But there aren't that many that I will say there will be no limit to how many times I listen to this record. And yet, with a lot of the Marillion catalogue, particularly those three, there is no limit to how many times I think I will listen to those records.
Do you think there's a difference between radio shows and podcast?
That's a really good question, actually. Yes, I do, but good radio makes a good podcast. But a lot of radio tends to be... This probably takes into an area where you start talking about podcasts that date and podcasts that don't. And a lot of radio, particularly if it's current affairs, will date. So, the politics podcasts I listen to, if I miss a few weeks, I don't tend to go back to them, because in reality, you've already passed. So I think if it's radio, for argument's sake, in more of a documentary type style. So I was listening to the show that you did with, and I think it's Ben, wasn't it, who does the Bob Dylan podcast?
Yeah.
Now, you can tell he works in radio. And would that have worked? Would that podcast have worked as a piece of radio? And I think the answer is absolutely yes. So in that respect, if that had been done for radio first and converted and packaged as a podcast, would it still work? Of course it would, because it's on a particular subject. It had very much a radio for, to a certain extent, kind of feel with it, in terms of the fact that the episodes are about 30 minutes long, and they're beautifully articulated and beautifully researched and presented. So I think in that respect, yes, they do. I think the problem comes if you're talking current affairs. Repurposing radio into a podcast is fine for current affairs show, but they don't stand the test of time. You won't go back and rediscover those. You have to listen to those to a certain extent in the moment. So that's not really answered your question, really. Yes, I think it does, but I think depending on the format and how they've been done will depend on the longevity of the product.
Okay. Why do you think podcasts have suddenly become popular? Well, have they suddenly become more popular than they were?
Do you know what? I still talk to people for whom 9 to 42 or Corona Diaries is the first podcast they've listened to. When you hear that, you think that's fantastic, because you've got a whole journey now. You've got a whole journey that's going to, because you potentially are going to get addicted to this format. And I think if you've got the period in your life, that moment in your life where you can incorporate a podcast into it, be it at the gym, be it out for a run, be it walking the dog, whatever it is, if you be it commuting, whatever it is, if you can find a space in your life to put a podcast experience into, because I do think they're a supplementary experience in a lot of ways. I do think they soundtrack a lot of other things that go on in your life. I mean, I listen to my podcast now. I used to listen to my podcast when I was driving. I don't do anything like the miles anymore. I had to go out and find another thing to do to incorporate podcasts into, because I'm not very good at just listening to a podcast, i.e. sitting in the house and just listening. So what I've started doing is walking. And I now walk. On the days when I don't run, I walk, and that is my podcast listening time. So I've created 3 to 4 hours a week of time for listening to podcasts in. So I think for a lot of people, it's not that you've not heard about them or you don't know what they are necessarily. I think when you find that particular podcast, so when you're jolted into the medium because it's somebody you know, or a band that you really like, or a personality that you really like who started doing one, I think that then kicks you onto a journey. And I think if you can then find the moment to listen, what most people I've ever spoken to have then done is they've had a thirst for other podcasts. And I think most people who listen to podcasts probably listen to anything between about 2 or 3 and 10. Yeah. Because you get a thirst for it. But you have to have, you have to be able to work out when are you going to listen to them, and for me, it has to be a soundtrack to something else. So for me, it's the soundtrack to when I walk, and it used to be the soundtrack to when I used to drive. But there's no denying, very few people, I think, listen to just one. I think if it works for you, and there's no reason why it wouldn't work for you, and one of the things I love about a podcast is that it's not a disruptive thing. So if you go to most social media is about people shouting. Yeah. It's about anything to distract you, to get you to look at their thing for 25, 30 seconds, maybe a minute and a half. And we scroll through stuff. We never finish watching that video clip. We never finish reading that paragraph. We just scroll through. And social media is all about disruption. Podcast is totally different. Most people listen to podcasts don't want the podcast to end. It's weird when you produce the stuff to listening to the stuff, because in reality, I listen to the Romaniacs podcast at 50 odd minutes most weeks, and I would say that's perfect length. My producer hat will say perfect length for a podcast, and yet when I'm listening to it, I want it to go on longer. Yeah. So, and I think that's unique in the formats at the moment, that it's a format where people, they really look forward to it arriving. They look forward to it landing. And it accompanies something they want to do, and they want that experience, because a podcast, it's like you're eavesdropping on a private conversation in a lot of instances, but it's only you. It's only you. You don't listen to podcasts as a group. You might listen to a piece of music as a group, but as a podcast, you tend to listen to on your own, often in earphones. So there's just that. It's just that solitary, experience. It's all for you. It's all in the moment. And I think once you start and you discover what they're all about, and of course the beauty is, there's going to be somebody who's going to produce a podcast that talks to exactly what you want to listen to. Absolutely. You don't have to go far to find exactly the thing that you want. So if you want true crime, you're sorted. If you want comedy, you're sorted. If you want drama, you're sorted. If you want celebrity, you're sorted. If you want to discuss music, politics, news, mental health, any of those, you can find what you want. So I don't think it's just started. I think individual journeys have been going on with podcasts probably for the last 10 years. And there's over 1 million podcasts out there in terms of individual shows. So it's not, but I think it's like anything, you need that point to step on the ride. And once you've found the point that pushes you onto the ride, I think for a lot of people, then that then becomes not an obsession, but it becomes something that becomes a special part of your life.
Definitely. Are there any episodes of shows that you've been a part of that have really stood out?
Yes, there's one.
Yep.
And it's one of my own, actually. It's not one. I'm very proud of all the things that I've done with the different people I've worked on. And there's been some great episodes of Corona Diaries, been great episodes of 942. Deborah's show had one very, very good episode with a very, very good interview that she did with a lady who lost a mum through breast cancer and then went on to dedicate her life to working with she produces cooling caps for people who are struggling with breast cancer or with any form of cancer. Actually, it's not just breast cancer, which was a really, really great episode. I did one episode of Therapy for Me where I abandoned the complete format because something had happened in the news. And you know what? I'm really embarrassed. I've forgotten the lady's Caroline Flack, was it? Who committed suicide, and it chimed with me because I'd been through a low moment in my life. I'd been through a moment in my life where I'd found myself contemplating suicide. And what had scared me about it was that when you're thinking about it, in that moment when you think, actually, you find yourself thinking, would life be easier if I wasn't here? And what you find yourself thinking is, would life be easier for the people around me? Because I'm very difficult to live with at the moment, and I appreciate that I'm a bit of a burden at the moment. And so would it? And you find yourself having a really very, very sort of pragmatic conversation with yourself about, well, actually, do you know what? There are definite pros on if I wasn't around. And it was an incredibly scary moment because, half an hour later or an hour later or whatever it was, I then thought back on this conversation and thought, Jesus, I could have done something, fairly catastrophic in that moment, because where my head was for that short space of time, what I was thinking was perfectly rational. And I found myself in that space thinking about thinking, well, actually, do you know what? I'm hurting at the moment. I'm in a lot of pain. There are a lot of people around me that are probably finding that they're struggling to deal with me struggling to deal with what I'm going through. And, it's a win-win. It could be a win-win here. And as I say, within an hour or a couple of hours, I can't remember the exact, you don't keep a record of these things, but I found myself looking back on that little thought process in my head and thought, Jesus, that was really scary. And it took me to then thinking about what had happened, with that lady and how I could totally empathise with what had happened in her life as she got to a point of thinking, do you know what? Actually, me just not being here will be the best solution for where I find myself. So I ended up speaking about that and just abandoned the format and just talked about that for I don't know, about 20 minutes, I guess. I can't remember the exact length of the thing. And I remember playing it to my wife and saying, "Can I put this out?" And she listened to it and she said, "Do you want to?" And I said, "Yeah, I'm fine to put it out. What do you think?" And she sort of said, "If you're comfortable to talk about it, then you should do it," which I did. So if I'm proud of one episode, I'm proud of that, because I wanted to do it, and it probably was the hardest session in front of a microphone of the 100 plus podcasts that I've been involved in. That was probably the hardest one.
Wow. But obviously, hopefully, well, it helps you through that thought process, actually just getting it out there.
Yeah, I mean, I ended up doing some counselling. I mean, we're going back a long time. We're going back a long time to a particular set of circumstances in my life that fortunately have never come round again. And the thing that I discussed was fleeting. In the scheme of things, it really was fleeting. The thing that scared me was how I suddenly realised how you could, because I'm one of these people that thinks, well, how could you do harm to yourself? How could you actually do that? And yet had a moment where I realised how you could, and that actually it was a very calm, rational thought process that that you find yourself going through. And depending on how that catches you in the moment, you may decide to act on that. And that, and I think people maybe don't, I was trying to sort of say to people, you just don't know. You just don't know, but don't look on the outside, or don't even think about what that person has been like all the time they've known you, because you actually have no clue what somebody who might end up taking their own life looks like. It isn't something you can spot, and it isn't something that because in that, as I say, in that moment when you find yourself thinking about it, it just seems a remarkably rational, solution to a problem. It's difficult to be proud of an episode like that in the respect of what you kind of in what you, but it was the important one, shall we say?
Yeah, and it's something that resonates with a lot of people as well. I know that for sure. Yeah. What other shows do you listen to in your own podcast listening?
Well, it's still the politics stuff. That's never gone away. I still find myself, my week is still Romaniacs. I listen to a bit of Newscast, which is the BBC News one with Laura Koomsberg. I listen to The Bunker, which is the same guys who produce Romaniacs, which is again very politics based. And then other things that catch my eye. I thoroughly enjoyed the David Tennant podcasts,
yes.
Which I thought those interviews were great. The one I did with Olivia Colman was absolutely fantastic.
Judi Dench made me laugh.
Oh yeah, well they're just. I mean, he's such a disarming character, and they were just such wonderful conversations. He's a natural for doing those kind of things. So that was very, very good. I still like the Matt Ford ones when he does the political party. I think they're absolutely fantastic. I think he's a really good host. His audio quality is a bit patchy, but as a host, he's absolutely great. And then I guess it's odd things at odd moments. Things kind of float in and float out. I'll listen to odd sport ones that have floated in and floated out. For a while, I went through absolutely howling at My Dad Wrote a Porno, which I thought was great. And it's the consistent ones are the politics ones, but other things, as I say, other things float in and out. I also listen to quite a lot of, I'll use sounds a lot, and this is where I guess the crossover with radio. I will listen to documentaries, so I will find Radio 4 documentaries and listen to those. I think I listened to a couple of Sherlock Holmes audiobooks while I was out walking, over the course of the last month or so. So I will flit around, and I think if I didn't listen to podcast, I wouldn't then listen to things like that as well, because obviously there's a difference between a podcast and audiobook to a certain extent, but in reality there isn't. Okay. Production value is slightly different and what have you, but it's still about immersing yourself in in that moment. So I think I'm probably I'm a podcast fan because I think I'm probably arrived at the point in my life where I'm a Radio 4 fan. And I think in reality my podcast listening is Radio 4 but without the bits that I don't like. So it's like Radio 4 without the Archers or the shipping forecast, really, or anything that Melvin brags on. And so those things that appear on Radio 4, like the documentaries, like the historical stuff or the politics stuff, or maybe some of the interview stuff, maybe a bit Desert Island Disky. So that's kind of my podcast listening is a bit like me editing Radio 4, really.
Yeah. What advice would you give to people starting off in podcasting?
Get used to the sound of your own voice. Because if unless you're just going to do production, if you're going to be on a podcast, you get used to the sound of your own voice, because it's not horrible, it's absolutely fine. And you're going to be listening to a lot of it, so get over that as quickly as you possibly can, and learn to love the sound of your own, not love the sound of your own voice, but learn not to hate the sound of your own voice. And then just don't think there's anything wrong. You've got to you set a mic up and you start. I mean, when Steve Hogarth and I started on TCD, I went round to his house and we set a couple of mics up and we just said, let's start talking, let's see where it goes. And we finished recording on the first day and we had 3 episodes. Yeah. Because we just found ourselves, we found a groove, we found something that worked, and then it was a case of, right, well, let's just throw it out there and see if people like it. And we threw it out there and people liked it. And then, we've subconsciously just kind of, I think it probably took us half a dozen shows to get into a format that is kind of where we've stuck. Because we got to know the audience. Talk to your audience as much as you can. Let them communicate with you. Try and respond to as much as you possibly can, because it's really helpful. But no, as I say, learn to love the sound of your own voice, because there's no point not. And the other thing I try and do is I don't over edit. I don't over edit for ums and pauses and this, that, and the other. Don't try and make it into something that's perfect. A lot, particularly if you're speaking to, if it's more than one person, it's a conversation, and it needs to be represented as a conversation. It's not supposed to be scripted. So don't overanalyze, don't over edit. Get to a level where your audio is not going to switch people off. So the quality of your audio is good enough that there's no reason not to engage with the podcast. But then don't worry too much about over editing. And as I say, talk to your audience. Talk to your audience as much as you possibly can.
Okay, right. We're coming to the end of this now. So let's let people know about the shows that you do and how they can get in touch with you and find you.
Right. Well, the easiest way to get in touch with me is I brand myself as A Short Stories for the podcast stuff. So, which I have to thank Deborah for, who I work with on the On Brand with. She came up and said, A Short Stories. And I was like, you're right. I like that. So you can find me on Facebook, A Short Stories. You can find me on Instagram, A Short Stories. You can find me on Twitter, A Short Stories. I have to admit, I'm not on Twitter very often. And just friend requests on Facebook, yeah, no problem, and same on Instagram, and there's multiple ways to chat on those kind of platforms. You'll find details of the shows on Facebook. So 9 to 42, which is the Guitar Show podcast with Jason Hunt, and you've got Corona Diaries, which is obviously the one with Steve Hogarth. That's relatively easy to find. And then Therapy for Me, which is the one that I do. And we're just about to start again with On Brand with Deborah. So, the course of the next 3 or 4 weeks, I've not pushed that very much on the Facebook platform, but I will do when the new series, is ready to come out. So that's the easiest way of finding it. I started a website 6 months ago, and it looks fine. And the only reason I've not launched it is because I was going to write some blog posts for it. And 6 months ago, I thought to myself, I'll write a few blog posts, put some content on before it goes out. Have I done it? Have I? Hell as like. And I ended up doing an interview at one of the On Brand with somebody who said the same thing. She said, I got a friend and he's set his own business 5 years ago, still hasn't finished his website because he's been inundated with work. And it's why I must get it finished because it's something that I need to finish and do. But in reality, I've never got round to launching it because I've managed to find ways of talking to people in the interim. I mean, you can find A Short Stories on, or Ant Short, you can find on LinkedIn as well. So, I as much as I should finish the website, I don't know what else it might. The problem with the website is they can end up being this static thing. And obviously, if you've got a LinkedIn profile and a Facebook page, they can be fairly fluid. And a static website is kind of great to prove you exist, but I'd rather spend my time recording podcasts than updating a website.
Okay, thank you very much, and thank you everybody for listening, and hope you listen again to another episode of Pods Like Us. Who's never here?
Who's never there? And the only town in the UK that's an anagram of wanker, I believe.
You're not the first one to mention that. Nope.
No. It's one of my little. It's one of my little go-tos for Newark. I was born and raised in Retford.
Okay. Oh, he's a ratty lad.
Okay. Yep. So only from down the road.
I'm still behind on the episodes of TCD. I think I'm got this week's. I might be the week before. Sometimes you listen to that much. You have to sort of like catch up.
You've been behind all the way through because you always post which one you're listening to.
I do, yes.
And you've been you've been pretty much behind all the way. I thought you'd virtually caught up, actually.
I did, and then I had a week off 2 weeks ago and did no listening for that whole week. Right. Found myself, because I listened to lots of podcast shows, hence why I'm doing this show, really.
Yeah. So what drew you to podcasts?
I think there's a similarity between us there. After listening to your Therapy for Me, it sort of resonated with me because, I've been in security for over 20 years now, which is not the best thing in the world. But so basically, while we were on lockdown, my hours went up, so I was doing about 70 hours in 5 days.
Yeah. Wow.
In a van, driving around sites, doing alarm response. And I just thought, but with it sounds a bit cliche, but with my 50th coming up next month, I thought, do you know what? I want to do something that's a bit different. And people have been telling me I should have a go at podcasting, and they've been telling me from long, long ago that I should try it because friends of mine who used to work for Radio Mansfield, they've had their own podcast now for about 12 years.
Right, yeah.
They won one of the originals, and they said back then, they said, look, you've got all the recording equipment with being a musician. You've got it all. They said, so why don't you just have a go at it? And I've held it off till now, and I thought, do you know what? I'll give it a go.
Yeah, it's... my background, my audio background was in 4-track recorders and recording songs going back to when I was at, even before I went to university, I'd got a little 4-track. I think if you've been around in recording audio and it's been something you've done off and on for the years, then actually, particularly if you've always written songs but they've never really been that good, and you've always done stuff but it's never really lived up to what you thought it really could have done, and you were never really a good enough musician to really follow that dream particularly, but you learnt a lot about bits of recording and what have you. Podcasting's quite a nice creative outlet if you haven't found a creative outlet that really works. And I think for me it was difficult to carry on writing songs. I wrote songs through in my sort of mid-20s, but there comes a point where you kind of stop, really, because life gets in the way, for one, but two, all that kind of teen angst and all that kind of nonsense kind of disappears. But you find yourself with this legacy of always having done bits of recording and all that kind of stuff, and then this is one of those areas where actually it's a kind of a halfway house between having done some music recording and done some song arrangement and a bit of production. So there's a slightly creative element to it, but also you understand what good audio is, which is helpful. And at the end of the day, as with any podcast, you've got to be able to listen to it. It's got to, if it's been recorded in a noisy room or it's not very good quality, then you do switch off fairly quickly. So, having that as a background has kind of helped, really.
Do you know what? I'm going to slot that into the main body of the show.
Oh, okay.
I think we ought to get on with it then.
Absolutely. I think I'm permanently in podcast mode, actually.
You seem to be. Do you mind if I nip to the toilet, Ant, and then we carry on in a couple of minutes?
Not in the slightest.
It's a good job I'm good at editing. Back in a moment.
Okay, no problem.
And we're back.
I never thought I'd have myself quoted to myself, but quite a few people have said that.
I'm sorry.
No, you're fine. You're fine. I think it's going to end up on a T-shirt.
Yes. Right. Let's get back on with the. Okay. Thank you very much, and thanks for this. It's appreciated.
It's an absolute pleasure. I hope. How's it going so far?
The 3 episodes that I've got up so far have got me 100 listens, which is really good for the first week.
Absolutely. Superb.
So hopefully it'll just grow from there, and yeah. Yeah,
well, the thing is, I'll as soon as you let me know when it's going out, I'll just share it with with the people who follow me, and obviously, I don't know if you're on the Marillion. The Marillion Facebook page, the Marillion. There's a private Facebook group. Hang on, I'll tell you what it's called. Marillion and Fans, I think, is the one. Yes, it is. That's got 17.1 thousand members on there. If you're not on there, it's that you might find this one might work. I've just found somebody with a CD single of Marillion Beautiful that they paid 99p for, talking about 99p singles.
Wow.
But that might be something that you might be able to drop on there.
Yep, I am on there, I think.
Yeah. And that might and that might pull a few people in. I've had quite a few people ask me how I know Steve and this, that, and the other. So that might well.
I didn't need to ask you that because you'd already answered that.
Yeah. Well, it kind of it's integral as part of the story, really, in terms of the, and I think that's the reason why the thing is we don't know we knew each other without knowing each other really, really well, and then it just became evident as soon as we started that we just, for whatever reason, it just worked. We both believe in the format. We both believe in the podcast. We both think the podcast is bringing some joy and light to people.
Yeah.
We don't take it too seriously, but at the same time, we also take it very seriously, if that makes sense.
It does, yeah.
We know it's full of mistakes. We know it's full of things we probably shouldn't say. We know it borders on the... We know it's not the most politically correct thing in the world, but at the same time, we also know it's not offensive. If that, we know there's nothing in there that is... but we also know that it's just two blokes talking.
There's a naturalness to it that's just comfortable.
Yes. Yeah. And we don't filter anything out. I think there's only 2 or 3 things we've ever taken out, really, that we thought might be not offensive, just things that had come along and odd things have been said. And but I bet we've edited about 3 or 4 things out. Probably not even that. Maybe 2 or 3 out of 20 odd episodes. So we've kind of got it. We've kind of got it about where it needs to be. And the only fear is that we run out of things to talk about. That's the only. But we keep saying that. We say that privately to each other all the time. What we're going to do this week? Oh, well, and do you know what? I've got 5 or 6 episode plans for it already, and that's without spending any time considering it. So I don't even think that's going to happen. I think people quite like the fact that we just bang on, really. And he's always, he repeats himself, and we will repeat ourselves more. And as I said to you, on that message, we're going to bump into bits in the show that have been covered in the diary, or vice versa. It is going to happen, but I think that's fine. I think that's absolutely fine.
Yep.
And I never thought, ever in a million years, thought I'd end up in this kind of situation doing something like that with somebody like Age. But
when you take chances with things, these things happen.
Yeah, absolutely. It's I could take this format to other people and say, look, the problem is with that is I don't think I could capture what I've got with H again, because I'm not going to find somebody else for whom the music is as important to me as this music's important to me. And I then just become that guy who's peddling that format, and I don't want to do that.
No,
I want the next podcast I work on to be a million miles away from this one.
Well, you won't have the same natural friendship and rapport that you've got with Steve.
No. I mean, 9 to 42 works with Jason because I've known Jason 20 years.
Yeah.
And is there anything else I'd like to do? Yeah, I'd like to do I'd love to do a history or a politics podcast.
Yeah.
I haven't got a clue where I would start, and I don't know. I'd need to find a way that allowed somebody who hasn't worked in that field all his life in. So that would have to be a learning curve for me. So I would have to find a way of speaking to people and almost start by saying, look, I know a real little bit, and I need to go and speak to this person to help me understand this particular thing because I just don't understand it. And it would have to be a voyage of discovery in that respect. but maybe that might be what I end up going to next. I don't know, but I certainly, as much as I could, take this format and pedal this round, because there are plenty of musicians now with the kind of reach that H has got.
Yeah.
But what would be the point?
That's true.
Really?
Right, I'll let you get on, and I'll do an H, and I'll try and get a nap before I'm at work tonight.
Yeah, try it. Apparently, it works very well. I'm gonna grab a brew.
Okay.
Thanks very much. And just let us know when it's going out, and I'll
Okay.
I will lend my limited bit of marketing support to.
Thank you very much. I've got a lot of shows already in the can, so there you go.
I'm good. I'm pretty good. It's good.
I think
Really
this
good.
is my 11th that I've recorded, and I've only
Bloody
put
hell.
3 out so far. So yeah.
Well, I mean, they always say don't start looking at your numbers until you've got to at least 10 shows.
That's it.
So,
Yeah. Okay.
all right.
Thank you, Anne. You
Cheers,
go and get
Martin.
yourself
Take
a
care.
brew. Take
I
care.
will do. Cheers. Bye.
Bye.